Have you ever stared at your phone, wondering why your love life feels like a complicated scroll? Do you wish there was a magic spell to make your crush notice you? Or a potion to mend your shattered heart? Well, for people in the medieval era, roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, these questions were not just rhetorical, they were literal. What shocking advice did they follow when love went wrong? What did their version of a self-help guru tell them to do when faced with a broken heart, unrequited affection, or a love that simply would not leave their mind? Number 1. Consulting a wise woman or local folk healer for love woes. In many medieval villages and towns, if you found yourself entangled in the messy vines of love and the usual channels of prayer or family advice seemed to fail, your next stop might have been the hut of a local wise woman or folk healer. These individuals were not typically educated in universities. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, often blending practical herbalism with ancient superstitions and a deep understanding of local psychological needs. They were the unofficial therapists, the unsung pharmacists, and sometimes the self-proclaimed magical practitioners for the common folk. A lovesick young peasant, a jilted merchant, or even a knight pining for a lady beyond his reach might approach such a figure desperate for a cure, a charm, or a way to influence the affections of another. The remedies offered by these wise women were a curious mix of natural elements and mystical rituals often tailored to the specific perceived problem. If someone was suffering from unrequited love, the wise woman might suggest gathering specific herbs under a particular moon phase, grinding them into a powder, and secretly scattering them on the beloved's path. She might recommend carrying a small sachet filled with certain dried flowers, animal bones, or a lock of the desired person's hair, believing these items held a sympathetic magical power. For a love that had gone sour, she might propose a cleansing ritual, perhaps involving smoke from burning specific plants or water drawn from a sacred well, all meant to purify the emotions and release the negative bonds. The effectiveness of these treatments was, of course, subjective and deeply rooted in belief. Power of suggestion and the psychological comfort of taking action, no matter how unusual, often played a significant role. A lovesick individual feeling helpless and overwhelmed might find solace in the ritual itself, in the belief that they were actively working towards a solution. The wise woman often understood the human psyche, knowing that offering a tangible remedy, even a strange one, could provide hope where there was despair. However, the advice from these healers was not without its strange and sometimes dangerous components. Some practices involved ingesting substances that could be harmless, but others might have been mildly toxic, or at least unpleasant. For instance, a wise woman might suggest drinking concoctions made from unusual animal parts, believing they held powerful magical properties. Imagine being told to consume a brew containing powdered bone from a particular bird or a dried lizard, all in the name of winning affection or banishing heartache. The line between medicinal herb and magical ingredient was often blurred, and empirical knowledge was scarce. The wisdom of these women was rooted in centuries of folklore, not in scientific method. Furthermore, the remedies often touched upon the supernatural. Charms might be crafted with specific symbols scratched onto wood or stone, intended to invoke spirits or celestial bodies for aid. Spells might be recited, involving incantations in a local dialect, believed to bind a person's will or redirect their emotions. There was a strong element of sympathetic magic, where a ritual performed on an effigy or a personal item was thought to directly influence the person it represented. If you wanted someone to love you, you might be instructed to make a small doll in their likeness and perform certain actions upon it. Believing the effect would transfer the role of the wise woman in medieval society was complex, while often respected and sought out, especially by the common people who had little access to formal medical care or legal recourse for emotional distress. They also walked a fine line. Their practices could be viewed with suspicion by the Church, which often condemned anything perceived as pagan ritual or witchcraft. Some wise women, despite their benevolent intentions, could find themselves accused of sorcery, particularly if their remedies failed spectacularly or if someone suffered harm, even inadvertently. This created a precarious existence for those who offered such unconventional love advice. Despite the potential dangers and the lack of scientific backing, the wise woman offered a unique form of medieval self-help. They provided a space for people to articulate their emotional pain and offered a tangible path, however unusual, towards resolution. Their advice, while often bizarre and sometimes ineffective by modern standards, was a reflection of a world where magic, folk, wisdom, and an intimate connection to the natural world were interwoven with daily life, especially when the bewildering emotions of love came knocking. A lovelorn individual seeking solace and a secret weapon against the torment of affection might well have found themselves in the quiet, herb-scented dwelling of a wise woman, ready to try anything that promised relief. Number 2. Avoiding the object of affection, flight, for lovesickness. When caught in the throes of unrequited love, or a love deemed unsuitable or dangerous, one piece of advice occasionally offered in the medieval period was surprisingly simple, yet often incredibly difficult to follow. Remove yourself from the presence of the beloved. This was not about blocking someone on social media, it was about literal physical distance, a form of self-imposed exile from the object of one's affections. The thinking behind this was rooted in the idea that love, particularly passionate or obsessive love, was a form of illness, a disease of the mind or body, and like any illness, it could be cured by removing the cause or the pathogen. If the sight, sound, or proximity of the beloved inflamed the passion, then their absence, it was reasoned, must surely cool it. This approach was often suggested by physicians who recognized lovesickness, or amour, heureuse, as a legitimate medical condition. They believed that the constant visual or sensory stimulation from the beloved kept the disease active, removed the stimulus, and the condition might abate. The 11th century Persian physician Avicenna, whose medical texts were highly influential in medieval Europe, discussed the importance of physical separation as a remedy for lovesickness, though he also suggested other treatments. His writings, translated and studied by medieval scholars, provided a theoretical framework for this seemingly straightforward piece of advice. However, implementing such advice was far from easy. For a knight infatuated with a married lady, or a young man of humble birth smitten with a noblewoman, physical separation might be the only viable option to avoid scandal, social ruin, or worse. The practicalities were immense. How does one simply vanish from a court, a village, or a bustling city? It might involve a pilgrimage, a journey to a distant land on a crusading vow, or even entering a monastery or convent. These drastic measures were not just about spiritual devotion. They could also serve as a desperate attempt to escape the torment of a love that could not be. Consider the tales of knights who, tormented by their unrequited love for a lady, would embark on perilous quests or retreat to remote hermitages. While these narratives often romanticize such acts, they also reflect a medieval understanding that extreme emotional states, particularly those related to love, required extreme measures. The act of fleeing the beloved was a self-punishment, a form of penance for an emotion deemed disruptive or sinful, or simply a last resort for an unbearable pain. The idea was that by breaking all contact, the mind would eventually be forced to forget, to move on, to heal. This advice, however, came with its own set of problems. Firstly, it often led to profound loneliness and isolation. The individual was not just separating from the object of their love, but often from their entire social circle and familiar surroundings. This could exacerbate feelings of melancholy and despair, rather than alleviating them. A lovesick individual, already fragile, might find themselves utterly alone, with no one to offer comfort or distraction. The very condition the flight was meant to cure could be worsened by the ensuing isolation. Secondly, the success of this strategy relied heavily on the individual's willpower and the absolute severance of all ties. In a world without telephones or instant messaging, physical distance was a far more effective barrier. But rumors, letters carried by travelers, or even just persistent memories could still keep the flame of affection alive. The human mind is not so easily commanded, and absence, as the saying sometimes goes, can make the heart grow fonder, or at least keep the longing painfully alive. Furthermore, this advice often ignored the underlying reasons for the intense attachment. It treated the symptom, the obsessive love, without addressing the deeper emotional or psychological needs that might have contributed to it. It was a blunt instrument, a desperate attempt to sever a connection rather than to understand or manage the emotion. For those who found themselves unable to follow through, or whose hearts stubbornly refused to forget, this advice could feel like a cruel joke, an impossible demand that only deepened their sense of failure and misery. The medieval understanding of emotions, while sophisticated in some ways, often lacked the tools to gently guide an individual through a lovesickness that was not simply a physical ailment, but a profound psychological distress. Path of flight, while tempting in its simplicity, rarely offered a straightforward or easy resolution to the complexities of the human heart. Number 3. Religious penance and asceticism for earthly desires. For many in the medieval period, especially those deeply immersed in the doctrines of the Christian Church, earthly love, particularly passionate or illicit love, was often viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. It was seen as a distraction from divine love, a temptation leading to sin, and a source of worldly suffering. When a person found themselves entangled in the painful web of lovesickness, unrequited desire, or even a love deemed sinful, the Church's answer was often rooted in penance and asceticism. This was a radical form of self-help, designed not to cultivate love, but to eradicate or redirect earthly desires entirely. The advice would often come from a confessor, a priest, or a spiritual advisor. If a young man was obsessed with a married woman, or a young woman found herself plagued by thoughts of a forbidden love, they might be instructed to undertake rigorous acts of penance. This could include long periods of fasting, denying the body its basic comforts in order to purify the soul. Imagine a lovesick soul, already weak with longing, deliberately abstaining from food and drink for days, believing that such suffering would cleanse them of their unwanted desires. The idea was to subdue the flesh and its earthly cravings, allowing the spirit to rise towards God. Another common form of penance was self-flagellation, the act of whipping oneself. While often associated with monastic orders or extreme penitence, it was also practiced by lay individuals seeking to atone for sins or to overcome powerful temptations, including those of the flesh. The belief was that by inflicting physical pain, one could mortify the body and redirect the mind away from sinful thoughts and desires. A person tormented by lust or forbidden affection might spend hours in prayer, punctuated by self-inflicted blows, hoping to beat the sin out of their heart. Beyond physical penance, asceticism involved a broader lifestyle of severe self-discipline and abstinence from various indulgences. This could mean giving up comfortable bedding, sleeping on hard floors, wearing rough clothing, or maintaining vows of silence. For someone struggling with love, they might be advised to withdraw from social gatherings, particularly those where they might encounter the object of their affection or be reminded of their desires. They might spend extended hours in prayer, meditation, or manual labor, all aimed at refocusing their energy away from earthly passions and towards spiritual devotion. Entering a monastery or convent was another, even more extreme form of ascetic self-help for the lovesick. For individuals whose hearts were irrevocably set on an unattainable or forbidden love, or who simply wished to renounce worldly attachments altogether, taking holy vows provided a definitive path to spiritual devotion and a life free from the complexities of earthly relationships. This was not a temporary measure, but a lifetime commitment, often seen as the ultimate escape from the torments of love and the pursuit of a higher divine love. The rationale behind these practices was deeply theological. The Church taught that the soul was often corrupted by the temptations of the body and the world. By denying the body, by embracing hardship and suffering, one could purify the soul and bring it closer to God. Love, in this context, if not directed towards God or sanctified within marriage, was a dangerous force, an attachment that pulled the individual away from their ultimate spiritual purpose. Penance and asceticism were therefore seen as powerful tools for self-mastery, a way to conquer the unruly emotions of the heart and to achieve spiritual peace. However, this advice, while religiously motivated, often came with significant human cost. The emotional pain of lovesickness was often compounded by physical suffering, leading to a vicious cycle of misery. The psychological impact of extreme self-denial could be devastating, potentially leading to depression, anxiety, or even physical illness from malnutrition or injury. The very act of focusing so intensely on the sin of love could paradoxically keep the unwanted thoughts and desires at the forefront of the mind, making them harder to overcome. Instead of truly finding peace, some might have simply traded one form of torment for another, cloaked in spiritual justification. The path of religious penance offered a clear moral framework for dealing with love, but it rarely offered a path to emotional fulfillment or psychological healing as understood in modern terms. It was a spiritual battle waged against the self, with the hope that victory would lead to salvation, even if it meant a life devoid of earthly affection. Number 4. Consulting a physician for lovesickness. Melancholy. In the medieval understanding of health, lovesickness, known as amor herios, or herios, was not merely a poetic metaphor for a broken heart. It was a recognized medical condition, as legitimate as a fever or a broken bone. Physicians of the era, drawing heavily from ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, particularly those of Hippocrates and Galen, believed in the theory of the 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These humors were thought to govern not only physical health, but also emotional and mental states. An imbalance in these humors was the root cause of illness, and lovesickness was often attributed to an excess of black bile, leading to melancholy. So if you were suffering from unrequited love, obsessive thoughts about a beloved, or profound sadness resulting from a failed romance, you might seek the advice of a learned physician, a university-trained expert. This was not the domain of folk healers, but of scholarly men who studied texts and practiced in urban centers. They would approach your love sickness with the same diagnostic rigor they applied to any other ailment, examining your pulse, checking your urine, and asking detailed questions about your symptoms, which might include sleeplessness, loss of appetite, sighing, pallor, or even fever. Once diagnosed with lovesickness, the prescribed remedies would vary, but they all aimed at restoring the humoral balance. One common treatment was bloodletting. This involved making an incision in a vein, often in the arm, to drain a certain amount of blood. The theory was that by removing excess blood, particularly if it was thought to be corrupted or overabundant due to the emotional turmoil, the body's humors would rebalance and the patient's lovesick state would improve. Imagine a lovesick individual already weak from emotional distress undergoing a procedure where a barber surgeon would cut their vein, believing this would literally drain the love out of them. Another popular remedy was purging. This involved administering strong laxatives or emetics to induce vomiting or diarrhea. The idea here was to expel the bad humors, especially black bile, from the body. The patient would be given powerful herbal, concoctions designed to violently cleanse their system. A lovesick person might find themselves enduring hours of extreme discomfort, emptying their bowels and stomach, all with the hope that they were simultaneously expelling the unwanted emotions and restoring their internal harmony. Beyond these more invasive procedures, physicians also prescribed dietary changes. Certain foods were believed to have properties that could either cool or inflame passions. For a lovesick person, they might recommend a diet heavy in cooling foods, such as lettuce, cucumbers, and other watery vegetables, and advise against heating foods like red meat, wine, or spices. The thought was that these dietary adjustments could help to reduce the intensity of the patient's emotional state by influencing their humoral balance. They might also recommend changes in environment or activity. Physicians understood the psychological impact of intense emotions, even if their underlying theories were humoral. They might suggest distractions, such as engaging in study, hunting, or other vigorous activities to divert the mind from the beloved. Music was also sometimes recommended as a therapeutic tool. If the patient's lovesickness was particularly severe, as discussed in the previous point, physical separation from the beloved might be advised, often as a last resort. However, the efficacy of these treatments for emotional distress was highly questionable, and some could even be harmful. Bloodletting could lead to weakness, infection, and even death if too much blood was lost. Violent purges could cause dehydration and further debilitate an already weakened patient. While some dietary advice might have had incidental health benefits, the primary humoral reasoning behind it was flawed. The fundamental issue was that medieval medicine, while sophisticated for its time, lacked a modern understanding of psychology, neurobiology, and the complex interplay of emotions. They treated lovesickness as a physical ailment caused by an imbalance of fluids rather than a complex emotional and psychological state. Treatments, therefore, were often physically taxing and ineffective for the emotional turmoil they aimed to cure. A lovesick individual, seeking genuine comfort and relief, might find themselves enduring painful and debilitating physical remedies that did little to soothe their aching heart. Number 5. Forced marriage or arranged marriages as a solution. In the medieval period, marriage was rarely about romantic love as we understand it today. It was primarily a social, economic, and political contract. For noble families, marriages solidified alliances, transferred land, and secured power. For commoners, they were about securing land, labor, and ensuring the continuation of the family line. Individual affection was often secondary, if it was considered at all. In this context, when a young person experienced intense, inconvenient, or unrequited love, a forced or arranged marriage could be presented as a very practical self-help solution, albeit one imposed by others. Terrible advice here was that marriage, in this form, would somehow solve the problems of the heart, or at least suppress them. If a young noblewoman became infatuated with a knight of lower standing, or a young man developed an inappropriate attachment to someone outside his social class, or a person already married, this was not just a personal problem. It was a family and social crisis. Such emotions threatened the established order, inheritance, and reputation. The elders of the family, parents, uncles, powerful patriarchs, would step in. Their solution would often be to arrange a marriage swiftly and decisively with a suitable partner who brought the right dowry, alliances, or stability. The idea was to channel the individual's energies into a legitimate, sanctioned union, thereby extinguishing the disruptive and unsanctioned affection. This forced marriage was often presented as a practical necessity, a way to secure the individual's future and to prevent further emotional complications. The expectation was that once married, the individual would simply learn to love their spouse, or at least fulfill their marital duties, and their previous infatuation would fade away. The daily realities of managing a household, raising children, and fulfilling social obligations were supposed to occupy the mind and heart, leaving no room for lingering romantic yearnings. This was not about healing a broken heart with true love. It was about redirecting the heart's focus through practical obligation. Historical examples abound of such forced unions. Kings and queens arranged their children's marriages from infancy to secure dynastic futures. Wealthy merchants arranged their children's unions to expand business networks. Even peasant families, while having more agency in some ways, still prioritized practical considerations like land and labor when arranging marriages for their children. Feelings of the individuals involved were often an afterthought. If a young woman pined for a charming bard, her parents might quickly marry her off to a stable, land-owning farmer, believing this practical solution would settle her unruly emotions. The advice here, whether explicitly stated or implicitly understood, was to suppress personal desire for the greater good of the family and society. It was a pragmatic approach to emotional turmoil, a belief that social structure and duty could override the messy complexities of individual affection. For the lovesick, it was a drastic intervention, a life sentence perhaps designed to pull them out of a dangerous emotional state by forcing them into a binding, often loveless commitment. However, this solution was often profoundly unsuccessful in addressing the emotional distress it aimed to cure. While it might have prevented social scandals or inappropriate liaisons, it often created deep unhappiness and resentment for the individuals involved. Imagine being forced to marry someone you do not love, while your heart aches for another. This could lead to a life of quiet desperation, emotional repression, and in some cases, outright rebellion or even secret affairs. The very emotional turmoil that the forced marriage was meant to solve could simply be driven underground, festering and causing long-term psychological pain. Moreover, such marriages often led to further complications, not solutions. Person forced into a loveless marriage might become bitter, uncooperative, or find themselves perpetually longing for what they could not have. This could impact the stability of the marriage itself, the upbringing of children, and the overall harmony of the household. It was a solution that prioritized social order and family lineage over individual well-being, often at great personal cost. The medieval approach in this instance was to treat love as a problem that could be fixed by societal decree rather than a complex human emotion requiring genuine understanding and care. The self-help here was less about the individual's inner healing and more about external control and conformity, often leaving a deeper wound than the lovesickness it sought to remedy. Number 6. Following courtly love rituals, including unrequited devotion. The concept of courtly love, or amour courtois, flourished in the high Middle Ages, particularly among the nobility in France and England. It was a highly idealized, often elaborate, and almost ritualistic system of love between a knight and a married noblewoman, almost always unattainable. It was more a game, a performance, and a source of poetic inspiration than a practical guide to happy relationships. For a lovesick individual in this aristocratic sphere, particularly a knight pining for a lady, the advice was not to move on or seek emotional healing, but to fully immerse oneself in the strict, often agonizing conventions of courtly love. And this advice, while beautiful in poetry, was often terrible for the heart. Core tenets of courtly love involved intense, passionate devotion, usually unrequited from a knight to a lady of higher social standing, who's almost always married to another man. The knight's love for the lady was meant to be ennobling, inspiring him to perform great deeds of chivalry, write poetry, and endure suffering with grace. The lady, in turn, remained aloof, setting challenges for the knight and granting only small, symbolic favors, perhaps a glance, a token, or a word of encouragement. This constant striving, coupled with perpetual denial, was believed to refine the knight's character and purify his love. So, if a knight found himself lovesick, consumed by an overwhelming passion for a noble lady, the self-help manual of the day would instruct him not to seek a reciprocal relationship, but to embrace the suffering. He was advised to keep his love secret, to sigh deeply, to grow pale, and to perform acts of heroism in the lady's name, without ever hoping for physical intimacy or even a public acknowledgement of their bond. The suffering itself was considered part of the process, a sign of the purity and intensity of his love. He was supposed to find virtue in his agony. This was codified in works like Andreas Capellanus's 12th century Latin treatise, De Amore, on love, sometimes translated as The Art of Courtly Love. Capellanus outlined rules for love, explaining how it was typically unrequited, often adulterous in its essence, though often remaining chaste in practice, and always inspiring. He even suggested that marriage could not truly coexist with love, as marriage introduced obligation and property, while true love was a free, spontaneous gift. For a lovesick person, this implied that their unrequited pain was the correct way to experience love, not a problem to be solved. The rituals of courtly love were numerous. The knight might wear the lady's favor in battle, dedicate his triumphs to her, compose songs in her honor, and engage in elaborate rituals of fealty, like a vassal pledging himself to a lord. He would observe her from afar, analyze her every gesture, and interpret her every fleeting expression. This constant observation, fueled by longing and denial, was meant to keep the flame of love alive, even if it caused immense emotional torment. The knight was expected to find joy in his very suffering, to view his lovesickness as a sign of his noble spirit and profound capacity for feeling. However, this system was inherently flawed and often detrimental to genuine emotional well-being. Firstly, it promoted a love that was by design unattainable and unfulfilling. It set up a dynamic where one party was constantly suffering from longing and the other was perpetually aloof, with no real path to mutual happiness or intimacy. This meant that the lovesick knight was essentially advised to pursue a path that guaranteed continued pain and frustration. Secondly, the focus on secrecy and unrequited devotion could lead to intense isolation and loneliness. The knight could not openly express his feelings, nor could he seek comfort from others about his specific romantic plight. His suffering was meant to be borne nobly and privately. This could lead to a deepening of melancholy and a sense of perpetual unfulfillment, rather than a resolution of emotional distress. Finally, the idealization of suffering and the avoidance of genuine reciprocal affection could warp an individual's understanding of healthy relationships. It glorified a form of love that was inherently dysfunctional, pushing individuals towards a fantasy that could never be realized. For someone genuinely seeking relief from the pain of love, this system offered only more pain, cloaked in the guise of virtue and nobility. It was a literary and social construct, not a practical guide to emotional health, leaving many lovesick souls trapped in an endless, unfulfilling loop of adoration and agony. Number 7. Using magical incantations and rituals with strange objects. When faced with the bewildering and often painful emotions of love, people in the medieval period, lacking modern psychological insights or effective medical treatments for emotional distress, often turned to magic. Not just the subtle charms of a wise woman, but explicit incantations, spells, and rituals involving bizarre and sometimes disturbing objects. This was a form of active self-help, where the lovesick individual, or someone acting on their behalf, attempted to manipulate the very forces of the universe to attract affection, banish unwanted feelings, or control the will of another. The advice was to literally try to cast a spell. Such practices were often found in grimoires, books of magic, or transmitted through oral tradition. These texts, though often condemned by the Church, circulated among those seeking supernatural intervention. The belief was that specific words, combined with carefully chosen ingredients and actions performed at astrologically opportune moments, could compel love, extinguish it, or redirect. One common magical tip for attracting love involved sympathetic magic, where an action performed on an object was believed to influence a person. For instance, a lovesick individual might be advised to obtain a personal item from the beloved, a lock of hair, a piece of clothing, or even a handful of earth from their footprints. This item would then be incorporated into a ritual. Imagine taking a lock of your crush's hair, braiding it with a specific herb like verbena, and then burying it under a certain tree at midnight while reciting an incantation. The intention was to bind the beloved's affection to the practitioner. Some rituals involved even stranger components. Animal parts were frequently used, believed to hold inherent magical properties. A lovesick person might be told to acquire the heart of a dove, or the eye of a raven, or the blood of a specific animal, to be dried, powdered, and either carried as a charm or secretly administered to the beloved. The belief was that the essence of the animal's characteristics, a dove for peace and love, a raven for knowledge or manipulation, would transfer its power to the spell. Imagine trying to slip a potion containing powdered animal organs into someone's drink, convinced it would make them fall in love with you. Specific days, hours, and planetary alignments were crucial for these rituals. A love spell might only be considered effective if performed on a Friday, associated with Venus, the planet of love, or during a particular moon phase. Incantations often invoked angels, demons, or specific planetary intelligences, asking them to influence the targeted individual's emotions. These verbal formulas were precise, often involving Latin phrases, mystical symbols, and repeated names, all designed to create a potent, magical effect. For those wanting to end a love or to banish an unwanted infatuation from their own mind, similar magical methods were employed, but with opposing intentions. A lovesick person might be told to take a specific plant, say rue or mandrake, known for their powerful properties, and burn it while chanting to sever the emotional ties. Or they might be instructed to fashion an effigy of the person they wish to forget, and then destroy it symbolically. The problem with this self-help was multifaceted. Firstly, it operated entirely on superstition and magical thinking, with no basis in reality. The desired effects rarely, if ever, materialized, leading to continued frustration and despair for the lovesick individual. A person deeply troubled by their feelings might pour their hope, time, and resources into these rituals only to be met with disappointment, further deepening their sense of helplessness. Secondly, these practices often crossed moral and ethical boundaries. Trying to magically compel someone to love you or to forget you was a form of manipulation, an attempt to override their free will. This could lead to a distorted understanding of relationships and affections, substituting genuine connection with an illusion of control. Finally, engaging in such magical practices was perilous in medieval society. Church severely condemned sorcery and witchcraft, often equating it with heresy. Individuals caught performing such rituals could face accusations, trials, and severe punishments, ranging from penance to imprisonment or even execution. So, while a lovesick person sought relief through these magical means, they also risked their very lives and souls by defying powerful religious authorities. The advice to use magical incantations and strange objects was a desperate, dangerous gamble in the medieval quest to conquer the complexities of the heart. Number 8. Interpreting dreams for clues to love. In the medieval period, dreams were not simply random nocturnal musings of the subconscious mind. They were often seen as profound messages, omens, or even divine communications. For someone grappling with love, whether it was unrequited affection, a troubled relationship, or anxiety about finding a spouse interpreting dreams became a popular form of self-help. The advice was to pay close attention to your dreams, for within their symbolic landscapes lay hidden clues about your romantic destiny, the true feelings of your beloved, or even remedies for your lovesick heart. Dream interpretation was a serious business, drawing on ancient texts and popular folklore. Medieval dream interpretation drew heavily from classical authors like Artemidorus, whose Venero Critica, the interpretation of dreams, was a foundational text. Christian thinkers also viewed dreams as potentially divine or demonic messages. So if you were a young maiden wondering if a particular squire was truly meant for you, or a merchant anxious about his arranged marriage, your dreams might be seen as a direct pipeline to understanding your love life. The approach to dream interpretation was often highly symbolic. Dreaming of certain animals might signify different romantic outcomes. For example, a dream of a dove might indicate peaceful love, while a dream of a snake could warn of treachery. Dreaming of specific colors, objects, or actions held precise meanings. If you dreamt of a rose, it might mean blossoming love. If it was withered, perhaps a love lost. If you dreamt of a journey, it might signify a future separation or a new romantic path. People would meticulously recall their dreams upon waking, sometimes even writing them down, and then consult dream books or experienced interpreters to decipher their meaning. These dream books were popular medieval texts, providing extensive lists of symbols and their corresponding interpretations. A lovesick individual desperate for answers might pore over such a book, searching for any sign, any glimmer of hope or warning about their romantic entanglement. Some interpretations were even more direct. If you dreamt of your beloved, the specific actions or words in the dream were thought to directly reveal their feelings or future intentions. If they smiled, it was a good sign. If they turned away, it was a warning. The emotional state of the dreamer within the dream was also crucial. If you felt joy in your dream, it might predict future happiness in love. If you felt sorrow, it might foreshadow heartbreak. Beyond predicting the future, dreams were also believed to offer solutions to emotional problems. Some medieval texts suggested that certain dreams could even act as a cure for lovesickness by providing a symbolic release or insight. If a lovesick person dreamt of being freed from their torment, or of their beloved turning into something repulsive, it might be interpreted as a divine message or a subconscious purification, offering a path to moving on. However, relying on dream interpretation as a form of self-help for love woes was often fraught with problems. Firstly, dream symbols are notoriously ambiguous and subjective. Different dream books or interpreters might offer conflicting meanings for the same symbol, leading to confusion rather than clarity. A lovesick person, desperate for a positive sign, might selectively interpret their dreams to fit their desires, or conversely be plagued by nightmares that only deepen their anxieties. Secondly, dreams often reflect our waking anxieties and desires, rather than providing objective truths. A lovesick individual dreaming constantly of their beloved might simply be experiencing their waking obsession manifesting in sleep, not a divinely inspired message. Treating these manifestations as literal prophecies or direct advice could lead to irrational decisions or false hopes, prolonging emotional suffering rather than alleviating it. Finally, the very act of obsessively analyzing dreams could exacerbate mental distress. Instead of processing and moving through their emotions, the lovesick individual might become fixated on cryptic messages from their subconscious, constantly seeking external validation for their feelings from an unreliable source. This could create a cycle of anxiety and disappointment where every unusual dream was scrutinized for a hidden meaning about their love, life often leading to more confusion than peace. In a world without modern psychology, dreams were a tantalizing but ultimately unreliable guide for navigating the turbulent waters of medieval love. Number 9. Love potions and charms with bizarre ingredients. In the medieval landscape of love and longing, where formal medical remedies for emotional distress were scarce and often ineffective, many turned to the alluring, if dangerous, promise of magic. Among the most popular self-help tips for the lovelorn were love potions and charms, concoctions designed to either ignite passion in the beloved, rekindle a dying flame, or even cure the drinker of an unwanted affection. The terrible advice here was to believe that a mixture of strange, often revolting, and sometimes dangerous ingredients could magically manipulate the most complex of human emotions. These potions and charms were not simply concoctions of herbs. They often included a shocking array of animal parts, human bodily fluids, and other highly questionable substances, all believed to possess sympathetic magical properties. The recipes for such low filters circulated in various manuscripts and popular lore passed down through generations. A lovesick individual, desperate for their beloved's affection, might seek out a practitioner or even attempt to brew one of these concoctions themselves. Imagine being told that to make someone fall in love with you, you needed to acquire blood from a bat, or a specific part of a frog, or even a lock of hair from a deceased person. These ingredients would be mixed with herbs, sometimes wine or water, and then secretly administered to the intended recipient. For instance, a common ingredient in some love potions was the menstrual blood of a woman, believed to have potent binding power due to its connection to fertility and the feminine cycle. The idea was that by consuming a part of the practitioner, the beloved would become bound to them emotionally. Other potions involved mandrake root, a plant notorious for its human-like shape and hallucinogenic properties. It was believed to possess powerful magical influence, particularly over love and fertility. A lovesick person might be advised to obtain a mandrake root, often at great cost and with great peril, and then prepare it according to a specific ritual, believing its essence would compel love. For those wanting to end a love or to cure themselves of a tormenting infatuation, potions were also prescribed. These might involve ingredients believed to have cooling or separating properties, like certain bitter herbs, or substances that were thought to drive away affection. Imagine drinking a potion made of powdered animal bones or the ashes of burnt objects, all with the hope of extinguishing the burning flame of love in your heart. Creation of these charms and potions often involved specific rituals. They might need to be prepared under a certain moon phase, at a particular hour, or with specific incantations recited over them. The practitioner might be required to fast, to wear special clothing, or to perform the ritual in a secluded liminal space like a crossroads or a graveyard. The belief was that these precise conditions enhanced the magical potency of the concoction. The grave problems with these love potions and charms are evident. Firstly, they were almost entirely ineffective. Human emotions are not swayed by bat blood or powdered roots. Any perceived success was likely due to coincidence, the power of suggestion, or the placebo effect. More often, they led to profound disappointment and continued heartache for the desperate individual. Secondly, and far more dangerously, many of the ingredients were unhygienic, toxic, or outright poisonous. Administering unknown substances, particularly those derived from animals or potentially contaminated sources, could lead to severe illness, poisoning, or even death for the unwitting recipient. A lovesick person attempting to brew a potion might inadvertently harm themselves or others. Imagine the horrific consequences of someone accidentally poisoning their beloved in a misguided attempt to induce love. Finally, the use of such magic was, as mentioned in previous chapters, highly condemned by the Church. Engaging in such practices could lead to accusations of witchcraft or sorcery, resulting in severe social ostracism, torture, or even execution. So while a lovesick individual sought a magical solution to their emotional pain, they risked not only their physical health, but also their freedom and life itself by dabbling in these forbidden remedies. The medieval love potion was a potent symbol of desperation, a dangerous gamble taken by those who believed a strange brew could mend or make a broken heart. Number 10. Bloodletting and purging for lovesickness, melancholy. In the medieval mind, lovesickness was no mere metaphor for a heavy heart. It was a bona fide medical condition, often diagnosed as a form of melancholy. The influential medical texts of the time, drawing heavily from the ancient Greek and Roman humoral theory, posited that the human body was governed by 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy individual possessed these humors in perfect balance. However, an imbalance was believed to be the root cause of all physical and mental ailments, including the consuming affliction of lovesickness. When a person presented with symptoms of extreme infatuation, obsessive thoughts about a beloved, a loss of appetite, sleeplessness, or a profound sadness linked to romantic longing, a medieval physician would often diagnose them with amor heroes or heroes, a specific kind of melancholy caused by love. The self-help. Advice from these learned medical professionals was not about emotional processing or communication, but about physically rebalancing the humors. The go-to solutions for restoring this delicate equilibrium were often bloodletting and purging, aggressive treatments that seem shocking by modern standards. Bloodletting was a ubiquitous practice in medieval medicine. It involved making an incision in a vein, often in the arm or neck, to drain a specific quantity of blood from the patient. For lovesickness, the theory was that an excess of black bile, or perhaps an overheating of the blood due to passionate emotion, was causing the mental and emotional distress. By removing blood, the physician aimed to cool the body, reduce inflammation, and literally drain away the corrupted humors contributing to the patient's lovesick state. Imagine a person, already weakened by sleepless nights and unrequited longing, being subjected to the sight and sensation of their own blood being drawn into a basin, with the hope that this physical depletion would somehow empty their heart of its unwanted affections. Quantity of blood removed could vary depending on the physician's judgment and the severity of the symptoms, but it was often significant. Patients might feel dizzy, weak, or even faint after the procedure. It was performed by physicians, or more commonly by barber surgeons, who had the necessary tools and practical skills. The practice was so ingrained that it was even depicted in medieval medical manuscripts, illustrating the various points on the body from which blood could be drawn. Concurrent with or alternative to bloodletting was purging, an equally aggressive method of humoral rebalancing. This involved administering powerful emetics, substances that induce vomiting, or laxatives, substances that induce diarrhea, to the patient. The goal was to violently expel the bad humors from the body through the digestive tract. The physician might prescribe strong herbal concoctions, sometimes mixed with other ingredients, designed to induce a thorough and often prolonged bout of sickness. A lovesick individual, already suffering from emotional distress, might find themselves enduring hours of stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea, believing that this intense physical cleansing would rid them of their melancholic love. For melancholy attributed to black bile, particular laxatives were used to cleanse the body of this humor. The unpleasantness of the experience was often seen as part of the cure, a sign that the treatment was working to expel the harmful substances from the system. Other remedies for lovesickness, though less drastic, also aimed at humoral balance. Dietary changes were often prescribed, advising patients to avoid hot foods that might inflame passions and consume cooling foods to calm the humors. Certain herbs were used not for their specific psychological effects, but for their perceived ability to influence the balance of fluids in the body. The fundamental flaw in this self-help approach was the underlying theory itself. While medieval physicians were observant and often compassionate, their understanding of human physiology and psychology was limited by the humoral model. They mistook complex emotional states for physical imbalances, and thus applied physical remedies to deeply psychological problems. The irony was that bloodletting and purging, while physically folded little to address the roots of romantic longing, obsession, or heartbreak. Instead, these treatments often exacerbated the patient's suffering. Bloodletting could lead to weakness, anemia, infection, and even death, especially if performed excessively. Purging could cause severe dehydration and further debilitate an already frail individual. A lovesick person seeking solace and relief would instead endure physical misery on top of their emotional pain, with no guarantee that their heart would be cured. The medieval medical advice for the lovelorn was a testament to a scientific era struggling to understand the human mind, often resulting in treatments that were more harmful than helpful, leaving the aching heart to suffer not only from its own torment, but from the aggressive attempts to cure it.